Freedom is never something outside of you, it is the unraveling of the limitations you have imposed upon yourself. The very thing that can liberate you often triggers fear because it challenges your identity, habits and comfort zones. You fear not because the path is dangerous, but because stepping onto it forces you to confront the unknown within yourself. Liberation requires courage, not in fighting the world, but in facing the truths you have been avoiding for years. Fear exists because the very thing that can free you asks you to step out of the patterns and identities you have long relied upon. Your mind has built a sense of safety around familiarity, routines, and the beliefs that define who you think you are. Liberation challenges all of this by asking you to question what you have always accepted as truth. The unknown appears threatening because it asks you to shed the comfort of the known and face the uncertainty of your own potential. When you cling to old habits and attachments, fear grows stronger. These patterns, though limiting, give a false sense of stability. The idea of letting them go feels like stepping into a void, even if that void is where your true freedom lies. The mind resists because it perceives any change as a potential loss, failing to see that release is a doorway to growth rather than destruction. Every familiar thought or emotion you have relied upon becomes a silent barrier between you and the liberation that is waiting. Liberation also asks you to confront yourself fully, including the parts you have hidden or ignored. Self-awareness exposes insecurities, unresolved emotions and limitations, and the mind instinctively fears this confrontation. When the truths about yourself are revealed, the comfort of old identities and habitual defenses loses its power. Fear emerges not because freedom is dangerous, but because the process of uncovering yourself challenges the very foundation upon which you have built your sense of security. The resistance to freedom is amplified by the illusions created by attachment and habit. You have trained yourself to equate safety with predictability and success with conformity. These invisible chains make stepping into liberation feel like a risk too great to take. Every attachment holds a story, every habit a pattern, and every belief a silent voice warning you against change. The very thing that could expand your life appears frightening because it disrupts the delicate equilibrium your mind has grown comfortable maintaining. When you finally recognize that fear is the indicator of where freedom lies, a new understanding emerges. The path to liberation is not about fighting fear, but about moving through it with awareness and courage. Every hesitation, every doubt, and every trembling step becomes a signpost pointing toward growth. By embracing the challenge, you discover that liberation is not outside you, it is the unfolding of your own potential, waiting patiently for the moment you choose to stand beyond fear. Change is intimidating because it forces the mind to step out of its familiar patterns and confront uncertainty. The human mind thrives on repetition, comfort and predictability, and anything that threatens this stability triggers resistance. Growth requires moving into the unknown, and the unknown is always uncomfortable because it demands that you rethink what you know, question long-held beliefs, and let go of familiar safety nets. Fear arises naturally in this process, not because change is harmful, but because it asks you to release control over outcomes you have grown attached to. The preference for repetition keeps you trapped in cycles that feel safe but limit your potential. Every habitual thought, repeated action, or familiar reaction reinforces the status quo, making new possibilities appear distant or unattainable. When change calls, the mind perceives it as a threat to the identity and security it has built around these routines. This perception creates hesitation, procrastination, and self-doubt, making the very thing that could expand your life feel frightening and unattainable. Resistance to change is also amplified by fear of the unknown consequences. When you have been conditioned to rely on familiar patterns, every step into unfamiliar territory seems risky. The mind imagines worst-case scenarios, exaggerates potential failures, and magnifies discomfort. This mental projection reinforces avoidance, keeping you tethered to repetition even when it no longer serves your growth. The illusion of safety becomes more compelling than the promise of transformation. Change challenges the foundation of who you believe yourself to be. Each new step disrupts habits, attitudes, and comfort zones, asking you to act without guarantees or reassurances. The mind instinctively resists because these disruptions threaten its sense of identity and control. Yet, it is precisely in this discomfort that your true capacity for growth is revealed, as stepping beyond repetition forces you to develop adaptability, courage, and self-reliance. Embracing change requires a conscious decision to move beyond fear and habitual patterns. Growth emerges only when the mind is willing to face uncertainty with awareness and presence rather than retreating into repetition. The discomfort of the unknown becomes a teacher, revealing strengths you did not know existed and possibilities that a repetition could never uncover. By learning to accept change as a necessary companion on the path of growth, you transform fear into a gateway for personal evolution. True freedom cannot exist while you are bound by attachments, no matter how comforting they may feel. Attachments create a sense of familiarity and security, but they also impose invisible limits on your choices, thoughts, and growth. Each attachment, whether to people, habits, beliefs, or possessions, subtly conditions your mind to seek safety in repetition rather than embrace the unknown. The comfort it provides is a trap, giving the illusion of stability while quietly restricting the full expression of your potential. Attachments shape your perception of the world, convincing you that you cannot survive or thrive without them. You begin to measure your happiness, identity, and worth through the lens of what you are attached to. This dependence creates fear of loss, hesitation in action, and a subtle resistance to change. Even when a release would open the path to growth and liberation, the mind clings to the familiar because the cost of letting go seems greater than the promise of freedom. Letting go of attachments requires courage because it forces you to confront uncertainty. The mind fears the void left behind, imagining absence as emptiness or deprivation. Yet the space created by release is fertile ground for self-discovery, creativity, and expanded awareness. When you step beyond attachment, you learn to rely on your own presence rather than external factors for stability. And this self-reliance becomes the foundation of true freedom. Attachments also distort your experience of life by creating dependencies that limit perception and awareness. You may act or think in ways that protect or maintain the attachment rather than in alignment with your highest potential. By loosening these invisible chains, you gain clarity in thought, decisiveness in action, and freedom to explore life without filters imposed by fear or habit. Every attachment released is a step toward experiencing existence more fully and authentically. The process of letting go transforms fear into insight and limitation into opportunity. You begin to see that attachments are not enemies to fight, but conditions to understand and transcend. True freedom is realized when you are able to stand independent of comforts, possessions, or familiar patterns, grounded in awareness and self-possession. In this state, life becomes expansive, unbounded, and rich with the possibilities that were always waiting beyond the attachments you once clung to. Fear of the unknown keeps you trapped in patterns that appear safe but quietly limit your growth. The mind clings to familiarity because it has learned to equate repetition with security. Every habitual thought, routine, or behavior reinforces the illusion that staying the same is protection. Yet beneath this seeming safety lies stagnation, as the fear of stepping into uncertainty prevents you from discovering the possibilities that exist beyond the boundaries of comfort. This fear shapes your perception of life, making even small changes feel threatening. You measure risk not by reality, but by imagined consequences, exaggerating potential failure and minimizing potential growth. The unknown becomes a source of anxiety rather than opportunity, and every hesitation reinforces the cycle of avoidance. Life begins to feel predictable and limited because the mind refuses to explore beyond its familiar territory. Fear of the unknown also affects your decisions and relationships. You may choose the familiar path even when it does not serve you, prioritizing comfort over growth. You might avoid expressing your true thoughts or taking meaningful action because the outcomes are uncertain. In this way, fear silently dictates your life, shaping choices and experiences in ways that keep you confined to patterns that no longer empower you. Confronting the unknown requires courage and presence. The first step is recognizing that fear itself is not the enemy, but a signal pointing toward growth. When you choose to face uncertainty intentionally, the mind begins to expand, revealing options and perspectives that were invisible before. Every step taken into unfamiliar territory strengthens resilience, sharpens awareness, and gradually diminishes the power fear holds over your decisions. Moving beyond fear of the unknown opens life to freedom and possibility. You begin to act from clarity rather than hesitation, making choices aligned with purpose instead of comfort. Challenges become teachers, change becomes opportunity, and the world unfolds as a landscape of growth rather than limitation. The moment you stop letting fear dictate your boundaries, the cycle of restriction breaks, revealing the vast potential that exists whenever you step beyond what is familiar. The mind resists liberation because it often mistakes freedom for loss. When the familiar patterns, habits, or attachments that define your life are challenged, the mind interprets the disruption as a threat. It fears that letting go of what it has relied upon will leave a void, a gap that seems unsafe and uncertain. This confusion creates resistance, making the very thing that could expand and liberate you feel frightening and undesirable. Every attachment carries an illusion of security, and the mind clings to this illusion even when it limits growth. Habits, relationships, beliefs, and comforts all create a framework that feels known and safe. Stepping beyond them requires trust in the unknown, and the mind struggles with trust because it has been conditioned to protect itself from perceived danger. The fear of losing control often outweighs the awareness of the freedom that awaits. Liberation demands that you face this fear and recognize its source. The gap that the mind fears is not emptiness but a space for possibility, creativity, and self-discovery. When you confront the fear directly, you begin to understand that what feels like loss is often the shedding of unnecessary weight, the removal of barriers that have constrained your potential. Fear diminishes as clarity grows, and liberation becomes an experience rather than a threat. The resistance to freedom is further reinforced by the mind's attachment to identity. You have built a sense of self around habits, roles and patterns, and liberation asks you to see beyond these definitions. This confrontation can feel destabilizing because it challenges everything you believed anchored you. Yet it is precisely in this destabilization that growth occurs, and the mind begins to recognize that freedom does not take away, but reveals the strength and capacity that have always existed within. Moving through this fear transforms your relationship with life. What once seemed threatening becomes a pathway to empowerment, and every step beyond familiar limitations reinforces trust in yourself. The confusion between loss and liberation fades as you experience firsthand that freedom is not a deprivation but an expansion. In this awareness, fear loses its authority and you discover that the very thing you once resisted is the key to living fully, consciously and powerfully. Habits, beliefs, hardened and conditioned patterns shape the way you see yourself in the world, often without your conscious awareness. From the moment you begin interacting with life, these patterns form a framework that defines what is safe, acceptable and possible. They guide your thoughts, influence your decisions and create a sense of identity that feels familiar and reliable. Yet this very familiarity becomes a cage, limiting the ways in which you can respond, grow and experience true freedom. These invisible chains are reinforced every day through repetition. When you act out of habit or unquestioned belief, the mind becomes comfortable with predictability. Comfort masks limitation, and what feels natural becomes restrictive. Every choice made within these patterns strengthens the chains, making it increasingly difficult to break free, explore new perspectives, or step into experiences that challenge your current understanding of yourself. Conditioned patterns often disguise themselves as necessity or logic. The mind convinces you that certain behaviors, reactions or ways of thinking are essential for survival or success. In reality, these patterns maintain control over your life, dictating responses to situations instead of allowing conscious awareness to guide you. The very structure meant to give stability becomes a barrier to liberation, keeping the extraordinary just beyond reach. Breaking free from these invisible chains requires conscious observation and deliberate action. Awareness is the first step, noticing when you are acting automatically, reacting habitually, or following beliefs without questioning them. Each moment of recognition weakens the grip of these patterns, creating space for choice, flexibility and growth. Freedom begins in the space between recognition and action, where you can choose how to respond rather than being guided by unconscious repetition. The more you challenge habits, beliefs and conditioned patterns, the more expansive your life becomes. What once seemed impossible gradually reveals itself as accessible and within your control. Stepping beyond these invisible chains allows you to act from clarity and presence rather than limitation and fear. In this process, freedom ceases to be an abstract idea and becomes a lived experience where each conscious action reinforces your power and capacity to shape life on your own terms. Self-awareness reveals the layers within yourself that have long been hidden or ignored. When you begin to look honestly at your thoughts, emotions and patterns, you start to notice the limitations that have quietly shaped your life. These limitations may be fears, insecurities, or habitual reactions that have gone unquestioned for years. Recognizing them can feel uncomfortable because it forces you to confront truths you have been avoiding. Yet it is only through this confrontation that real growth becomes possible. The fear of facing these limitations often holds you back more than the limitations themselves. The mind prefers the illusion of safety provided by avoidance over the discomfort of self-confrontation. Each time you shy away from examining yourself, you reinforce old patterns and miss opportunities to expand your potential. Fear makes the unknown within yourself seem more dangerous than it actually is, and this exaggeration keeps you tethered to familiar but limiting ways of being. Self-awareness is not simply noticing your flaws, it is also recognizing your capacity to change and evolve. When you confront limitations directly, you create a space for conscious choice rather than automatic reaction. Every insight gained through awareness allows you to step beyond the boundaries previously imposed by fear and habit. This process transforms limitations from permanent barriers into temporary markers that guide your growth and development. Facing limitations requires courage because it destabilizes the identity you have built around familiarity and comfort. When long-held beliefs, behaviors, or emotional responses are challenged, it can feel like losing a part of yourself. Yet this destabilization is necessary for expansion. By moving through fear and observing yourself without judgment, you discover strength, clarity, and resilience that were always present but obscured by avoidance and habitual patterns. The practice of self-awareness ultimately liberates you from the hidden constraints that fear has maintained. As you confront limitations with honesty and courage, you begin to act from presence rather than reaction, from insight rather than habit. Each step into awareness strengthens your ability to explore new possibilities, realize your true potential, and live a life guided by conscious choice rather than unconscious fear. In this way, self-awareness becomes both a mirror and a key, reflecting your current state while unlocking the doors to who you are capable of becoming. Liberation demands that you face the discomforts you have long avoided. It asks you to step beyond the routine's habits and comforts that have created a sense of safety, even if that safety is limiting. When you move toward freedom, insecurities you have buried beneath layers of distraction and avoidance begin to surface. These insecurities, once ignored, now require attention, reflection, and resolution, forcing you to confront parts of yourself you may have long denied or suppressed. Unresolved emotions also rise to the surface as you pursue liberation. Feelings that were left unattended, whether fear, anger, sadness, or guilt, begin to demand acknowledgement. The mind resists this confrontation because it associates emotional release with vulnerability and risk. Yet avoiding these emotions only strengthens their influence over your behavior, creating patterns of reaction that keep you tethered to limitation rather than aligned with freedom. Facing insecurities and unresolved emotions requires courage and persistence. You must observe them without judgment, understanding that they are neither permanent nor defining. Each encounter with these aspects of yourself is an opportunity to dissolve their power, reclaim energy, and integrate lessons that strengthen your awareness. Liberation is not about escaping these emotions, but learning to navigate them with clarity and composure. As you confront what you have avoided, the mind and heart begin to realign. The discomfort that once seemed unbearable transforms into insight and clarity. You start to recognize that your insecurities are not obstacles to freedom, but indicators of areas where growth is possible. Each unresolved emotion that is faced and understood becomes a stepping stone toward a more grounded and empowered state of being. Liberation ultimately reshapes your relationship with yourself. By addressing insecurities and unresolved emotions directly, you free yourself from their silent control. Life becomes less about avoiding discomfort and more about engaging with it consciously, learning from it, and using it to expand your capacity for strength, awareness, and freedom. In this process, the very challenges you once feared become the instruments through which liberation is realized. Fear is the mind's way of signaling that something beyond your current understanding or comfort zone is approaching. It is a natural resistance that arises whenever you are on the verge of expansion, growth, or transformation. The instinct to retreat or avoid is not a flaw but a mechanism designed to protect you from perceived danger. Yet when this mechanism is misapplied to opportunities for growth, it becomes a barrier that prevents you from realizing your full potential. Overcoming fear requires conscious awareness of its presence and its patterns. You must observe how it influences your thoughts, decisions, and actions without being dominated by it. By bringing attention to fear, you create a space between instinctive reaction and deliberate response, allowing yourself to act from clarity rather than avoidance. Awareness itself diminishes fear's authority because what is seen clearly cannot control you in silence. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. When you choose to move forward even while fear exists, you exercise mastery over the impulses that once held you back. Each step taken in conscious defiance of fear strengthens your inner stability, proving to yourself that growth is possible even when the mind signals danger. Courage is built incrementally, moment by moment, through consistent engagement with what is uncomfortable. Deliberate choice is essential in transforming fear into empowerment. You cannot wait for fear to vanish or hope that conditions become perfectly safe. Action must be taken consciously and intentionally. By choosing to step forward, to speak, to explore, or to release attachments, you assert control over your life rather than letting fear dictate the direction of your experiences. Each deliberate choice reinforces the understanding that fear is not an absolute limit, but a threshold to cross. Facing fear directly transforms it into a guide rather than an obstacle. The very situations that once seemed intimidating become opportunities for insight, growth and liberation. As you continue to act with courage and conscious intent, fear loses its ability to paralyze you and becomes a marker pointing toward areas where expansion is possible. In this process, what was once a source of limitation becomes the instrument through which strength, awareness and freedom are cultivated. True freedom cannot exist while the mind is controlled by hesitation or uncertainty. Whenever fear dominates your thoughts, every choice becomes diluted, and every action is measured against imagined risks rather than guided by awareness, the energy that could be used to explore, create, or grow is instead consumed by doubt and restraint. Only by stepping beyond this hesitation can you access the clarity needed to move intentionally and purposefully through life. Acting from clarity requires that you recognize the patterns that keep you trapped in fear. The mind often convinces you that caution is safety, that delay is protection, and that inaction prevents loss or harm. Yet this reasoning is deceptive, for hesitation is itself a limitation. It keeps you confined to familiar patterns and prevents you from experiencing the expansive possibilities that exist beyond the boundaries of fear. Clarity emerges when you observe these patterns without judgment and choose action consciously. The path to liberation is always within, yet it appears daunting because it demands honesty, courage and self-reflection. The very fears that hold you back are the signposts pointing toward your growth. By acknowledging them, facing them, and choosing to move forward despite them, you step into a life that is unbound, authentic, and aligned with your deepest potential. Fear becomes not a barrier, but a guide leading you toward the very freedom you have been resisting.